Hi, my name is Jamie Bilsbach, and I'm the Center Director for Central Mountain, SBDC, and welcome to Transformative New Paradigm Shifts. You can reach our center at centralsbdc.org, as well as on all the socials. The SBDC Center offers free confidential consulting, and we do that in two ways. One, we have 8 consultants that are local, serving Chaffee, Lake, and Park counties. And then we have access to all the state counselors. We also offer low cost or free training, such as the one today, and access to money and capital, helping with PPP and EIDL with the federal funding, grants and loans, and also with Energize Colorado and all our local community foundation funding, as well as traditional loan funding. Before we start, I really want to stress how wonderful these new podcasts that I've discovered, and I'm sure many of you have as well. Brene Brown is doing an Unlocking Us podcast series. And actually, the day of the election, she did this incredible session called Strong Back, Soft Front, and Wild Heart. And I really encourage you to listen to it and to thoughtfully consider her reflections. And then she did an Unlocking Us episode with Elizabeth Lesser. And it was just incredible again, and very thought-provoking as we move forward into new paradigms. And of course, her podcast or Parcast, Dare to Lead, is also incredible to listen to. So I hope you'll take a look at those. When we're talking about paradigm shifts, before we hear from our panelists, I kind of wanted to do an introduction about the description of paradigms. And Joel Barker, the author of Paradigms, The Business of Discovering the Future, says, a paradigm is a set of rules, written or unwritten, that establishes boundaries within which we learn how to be successful. And then from a mind-body perspective, it's described as paradigm shifts are usually felt the most intensely out of all other mind and body life shifts, because it creates a great deal of contrast between what you used to think and what you think now. And I have reflected on this for quite a while. I, almost 8 years ago now, lost my husband. And everything that I thought, obviously he was young and I didn't see it coming, and it just changed everything about what I thought of my life, my world, my work ethic, and to what I think now. And it turned out, after 2 years of tremendous despair and complete alteration of myself, to be what I now consider, almost 8 years later, and very happily married again, that he gave me a gift of understanding life and it's worth living, and the trying to find a balance, which I'm always still struggling with, of work and life, but putting family first. And I think this pandemic that we're experiencing with COVID certainly takes us on that journey. Obviously, the economic destruction to our economy and the uncertainty of how long it could take for recovery. Some cases we've heard up to 5 years. And you even think the mental health crisis that we're going through with diverse feelings and fear and conflict as opposed to resolution. So I hope we'll discover some solutions for that in our discussion today. And you will be hearing from Janessa Gans Wilder, who is the founder of Euphorities Institute, which is an international peace building institute. So we'll hear the world perspective on paradigm shifts. And then we'll reach out to Delaney Keating, who is the managing director of Startup Colorado, drilling it down to a business perspective as well as work life, and talking about collaborative efforts. And she's described as a change maker, and she truly, truly is. And then Jenna Pfingston, who is the owner of JalaBlu Collective Healing and she's an embodied wisdom coach. And Jenna actually was one of the first people I reached out to in my despair all those years ago to try to help me through grief. And she was phenomenal. So I'm so looking forward to hearing from these ladies. It is my great pleasure to introduce Janessa Gans-Wilder. Janessa is a former CIA officer turned peace builder, social entrepreneur, and nonprofit executive. She founded the Euphorides Institute after 5 years at the CIA, which was focused on the Middle East, including serving 21 months in Iraq from 2003 to 2005. Janessa is a frequent speaker in interfaith, community, government, international, and educational settings, and a TEDx speaker. She has written dozens of articles and been interviewed on major news outlets, including CBS, CNN, Los Angeles Times, the Christian Science Monitor, Democracy Now!, and many more. Please help me welcome Janessa Gans-Wilder.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for that wonderful introduction to this topic that I know that we're all thinking a lot about, and just that let's just honor that we can even have a conversation today about transforming our paradigm shifts, because that kind of means that means something is out of whack, and that we are yearning for that paradigm shift. We are looking for change, and that we're open to it. So just the fact that we can have a topic like this that we're all conversing on is very meaningful to me. And I think when I reflect on that topic of what are the transformative paradigm shifts that we are leaning into, that we are seeking, and for me, the main one that just sort of undergirds all the other things that are going on and all the chaos, it's this shift that is happening from this belief that we are disconnected or divided or different, to this sense of unity, this sense of oneness. You even look at our planet, the reality of the world is this deep interconnection from our financial markets that are intertwined, from climate change, from issues like trafficking and the drug trade that span borders. And there's so much that transcends these sort of artificial nation state borders and that connects us deeply. And yet everything, we turn on the news, everything, our infrastructure, our institutions, our frame of reference screams division, screams divisiveness. So I think that's sort of that tension point that we're experiencing, is the difference between what we sense at this deeper level, and we see the reality of this global interconnectedness, this global oneness, and yet we live in boxes that try to separate and divide. So that doesn't feel sustainable. And so to me, the paradigm shift is, how do we go from one to the other, and how messy will it be as we shift from what is not sustainable to being more in alignment with the way that the world is today. This is the reality. I remember asking Madeleine Albright, she came to speak at where I was teaching, and I said, why is the field of political science and international relations, we're still talking about borders and nation states relating, and why are we not talking about this global interconnectedness? And she said, oh, because the field is about 20 years behind. So even our academics, our intellectuals are still stuck in this old paradigm, and yet we're very much yearning for the new. So when I was thinking about this topic, what came to mind was a story. This was the last trip pre-COVID I took. And it was a trip last January to India, and I'd never been to India before. And I was talking to this incredible man who works with kids in slums and feeds 10,000 people. And it's just an amazing man. And he was telling me this story about a CNN journalist that came to visit him and shadow his work. And he refused to be interviewed, but he said, well, you can come and follow along and film sort of what I do day to day. So he was out in one of these far villages, and he went over to this woman, and this old woman, and she was feeding ants. She had some crumbs in a plate, and she was taking the crumbs and one by one placing them for these ants. And the Indian man, the wise man, said to the journalist, he said, why don't you go spend some time with that old lady and do what she does? And so the journalist went over and like sprinkled the crumbs, on the ground. And he said, no, look at how the old woman is doing it. Look how carefully she's placing each crumb of bread. See if you can do that. So then the journalist, did it and tried to put it down carefully for the ants. And so after a time, the journalist got really ill and was sick, and the old woman took her into her home and put her up in the bed, and all night stayed with her and put cold compresses. She had terrible fever, stayed up with her the whole night by her bedside and comforting her and holding her. And the journalist, as she got better, she told the Indian man, she said, I have never been treated so well, not even by my own mother. I can't believe how this woman took care of me. And so she got better, and they were finally driving off, and they saw this mass of people. And the journalist said to the man, where are they going? What is this? And he said, oh, they're going on a pilgrimage. And she said, stop the car. I need to get out. And he said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm going to make a pilgrimage back to that old woman's house. But well, by this time they were hours away. And he said, you can't just do this. I've got work to do, And she said, nope, I'm getting out now. And she made her way back to this woman's house. And the old woman was so astonished by how much how it had meant so much to her. And she just said, I didn't do anything unusual. What do you mean? Why would you come do a pilgrimage to me, to see me? And then the Indian man said to her, you saw how well she took care of those ants. Didn't you imagine, how she would take care of you? And I just loved, and then of course, then it was a life transforming experience for this journalist. And something about that story just always sticks with me when I think about, well, one, how just so simple of an act can mean so much, can be so transformative. And then I just think about the old woman and her relationship to everything, that she would feed the ants and keep these breadcrumbs, and just how the connections that she must have felt, and then how she treated the journalist, this stranger coming into her village and took her into her home, and just that incredible sense of connectedness that she felt, and then the generosity of spirit, and just so moving. And so that's just kind of been, that's like, I started off the year with that story, and it's sort of been this theme of, wow, what would it look like for me to remember the ants, to be conscious of everything, even the littlest, tiniest thing, and to treat them with such reverence, and to treat the other with a reverence even. And so bringing that into the sense of where we are right now, just last weekend, or whenever our election was, week and a half, I was on a call that morning with the founder of moveon.org, actually, and then she started a group called Living Room Conversations. And she said, while we're all focused on this political level, the leadership level, that leaders stand on the foundation of the grassroots, that, we actually don't it's not about them and what are they going to do for us and how are they going to change the country. It's actually up to each one of us. And she said, we have gotten so good at lose-lose outcomes. We've forgotten how to have win-win outcomes. And she said this wonderful thing that we need to restore our connections in order to avoid mutual destruction. And I love that she said restoring our connections and not we need to forge connections, we need to create connections, because that to me is that it's the unity is already there. Those connections are already there. You know, this woman saw the ants as part of her of the ecosystem that she was part of, you know, that they belonged and she belonged and they were all part of that. So I love this idea of us not having to create connections anew with people that we disagree with or people who are on the other side, or just as we feel these stark differences and divisions in community, that it's about restoring those connections that are already there. And I think we're in an amazing time to take advantage of that. You know, I think about the day before the election, I was on a Zoom call, as so many of us now live on Zoom. And this Zoom call was about 10 people, and there was one from Egypt, one from Peru, one from Yemen, one from Venezuela. It was like, and then one from India, and one other country in South. It was just this amazing, 12 of us, and all these different countries, and there were 3 simultaneous language translations going on as part of this call. So I would only hear the language, I would hear it in English, but they were hearing it translated in their languages. And I thought, how amazing that today's technology allows us to, in real time, interact with people around the world in our own language even. And I was even thinking back, my first time abroad, I was 12 years old. I spent the year in France, and I was allowed 1 5-minute phone call once a month on Sundays because it was cheapest, and it was a scratchy line, and I'd talk to my parents and they could barely hear me and there was a delay, and other than that little phone call, I had no idea what was going on in their world, and they had no idea what I was doing off in France. And now we have this simultaneous ability to plug in and to see and to interact and to have meaningful conversations with people around the world. And it's made my work, at least, possible. I mean, there's no way that you could have a global peace building organization. I live here in a small town in Northern California. It's amazing. It's a miracle to me that on a daily basis, I can plug in and have conversations with these peace builders around the world. And what that does is it expands our sense of community, that no longer is it just the people that you see day to day or interact with that you get to know, but that you can have a real value sharing, a real meeting of hearts with people, all different places, and you can find that common cause, and you can organize based on that, and you can lift each other up, and you can inspire. So we're truly connected in ways that allow that expanse of community and allow us to, what we talked about at the beginning about this paradigm shift from, not just to the reality of our global interconnectedness. Now we can actually realize that and act on that. And what that opens up to me is an amazing thing. It's just, what is the potential there? What can any small group of people, as Margaret Mead says, that's the only thing that ever has changed the world. But as we connect and create new ecosystems of organization, of unity, as other institutions are breaking down, then there's all this possibility, and it's happening right now. I'm sure many of us, there's one narrative that we see playing out that dominates the media, and that narrative really strikes fear in our hearts, because it is a narrative of division. It's a narrative of dysfunction. It's a narrative of disease, of all these things that just dominates. And yeah, I'm sure you all sense that. I know I am so grateful to be part of so many communities that constantly reinforce that there's actually this other narrative going on of people who absolutely are practicing compassion, are practicing that, are seeing that oneness, and who are generously, like this woman, this woman feeding ants. But there's so many simple things, simple acts of kindness, and simple acts of peace that people are building in their communities, in their lives, and their families, that are rippling out in ways that may be under the surface now, but that feel so much more tangible and powerful than the shouting voices on the news, or that just dominate. It's dominant, but it's not as powerful. And I'll just share one other thing that, for me, why I lean so deeply into that truth, and why I just believe it with all my heart, is that I saw that even in the war zone in Iraq. When I was there, I was a counterinsurgency analyst my first year in Iraq, and was with the Marines as they were going into different places, and was outside Fallujah during the first major battle, and sort of saw firsthand where the path of division leads us. That war zones are not pretty places. And I've never felt so depleted and so afraid and so dark. It was just such a heavy, dark, horrible feeling to know how many lives were being lost, and to see our own Marines coming back wounded from the field, and to feel so helpless. Like, where does this road end? It just felt that there was no end to this way of doing things, because every person we took off our high value target list, every terrorist we took out, there were 10 more to fill their place. So where that was going was bleak and dark and very heavy. And right after that first major battle, which was the closest to the front lines I had been on, I was over by, I was actually sitting by the Euphrates River. And I just took a moment. I'd gone for a run, and I was just looking out at that river. And what I saw was such a contrast to what I had just seen outside Fallujah. I saw this beautiful blue amidst this desert. I saw this beautiful current of water flowing, like this incredible current of life that was bringing nourishment to the desert. And it was beautiful, and it was quiet. There were no bombs going off. There was nothing but the sound of this gurgling water and the wind through the bulrushes. And it was just a picture of peace. What was so amazing is I just was struck by that and taking that in. It was like my body was yearning for this life and this peace, was that it flowed just a few miles downstream right through the middle of Fallujah. And so the river of peace and the death and war were happening in the same space. And the question that came to my mind was, which will you choose? And I realized that I couldn't have focused on both at the same time. During the war, I didn't even notice this river passing by. And what I also realized was that no matter how many bombs went off, no matter how much death and destruction, it never once touched that river. That river flowed even in the midst of the most horrible circumstance. It flowed untouched, unimpeded. Nothing could take it off course. And so I knew in that moment that the river was more powerful, even though so much more subtle, even though unnoticed. It was more powerful, and nothing could affect its flow. And so I said out loud, my whole being just called for it. I said, I choose the river. And I didn't know then what that meant, but that led me to quit my job as a counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and wanting to throw more of my weight, throw more of my life into choosing the river and helping other people to choose life and choose peace. Because even in the midst, and what I've seen so many times, even the midst of the most devastating scary, frightening circumstances, there is a river. There is always a river if we look for it. So, and that goes back to what Joan said, you know, the connections are already there. We're just restoring them. And everything is in balance. You know, the ants are there. We just have to notice them and feed them. So I'll just conclude with that. Oh, one other thing I want to conclude with actually is just the with the noticing then comes the courage. And Jamie, you talked about Brene Brown, and she does so much about daring to lead and the courage. And having been in war zones, and I just think, you know, we think of courage as this like manly, you know, putting your armor on and going out into battle, but courage comes from the word cœur, the French word heart. Cœur means heart. And so courage actually comes from our love, our deep love. And so the more we cultivate that heart and that love for others, then the deeper our courage, the bigger our courage will be. And that's what we're then bringing into these scary circumstances. So I just really love that. Just how do we deepen our heart, deepen our love, and deepen our courage. That's all for me, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Janessa. And I've been working a long time on opening my heart space, because I think you just shut down more and more as you try to not be influenced by a lot of the negative energy. And I do see you as such a strong, loving, kind person making a difference in our world, which is just amazing. So thank you. And to the audience, we will be opening this up to a panel discussion and Q&A, and we'll have about 20-25 minutes to do that. And so start thinking now some of the questions you might want to ask Janessa. And I have on the screen now her contact information and a quote from her blog, which I just thought was brilliant. So thank you, Janessa.
Thank you.
Next slide. We're going to do another poll. And oops, I see I also need to admit somebody. Do you run your business with a conscious capitalism focus, which means, i.e., ideals of people over profit? So from your rural perspective, do you do that? Yes, no, or I'm thinking about doing so. And we'll give that a few more minutes. And it looks like we have, the numbers are changing, so I better wait a few more minutes. Looks like we have 67% saying yes, and 33% saying I'm thinking about doing so, and no one saying no. So next slide, please. It is my great pleasure to introduce Delaney Keating, and she is the Managing Director for Startup Colorado. She's a seasoned creative, just immensely creative entrepreneur and a change agent. She has successfully owned and operated and exited her first company, and has since been dedicated to fostering ingrained cultural values for art and innovation. And one of my favorite phrases that really describes Delaney is that she is a change maker, truly a change maker. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Delaney.
It looks like my video might have been turned off. I need permission to turn it on.
So, Leanne, are you able to turn Delaney's video back on?
Let's see.
And I need screen sharing as well. There we go. We've got video. And can I allow screen sharing? Bear with us, folks. we're coming. As we figure that out, my apologies that I have so many lines across my face. I work from a 4x8 greenhouse in my yard, and the sun has changed direction. And I've yet to figure out, I've got to revamp a plan here for work for the winter as the sun's at a different angle. But I also live in Gunnison, Colorado, which is, as those of you in Chaffee County know, the land of a long winter. So I'm trying to extend my sunroom as long as I can. And did we get there yet? Looks like we got there. Thank you so much, Leanne. I appreciate it. Well, the conscious capitalism lead-in was a great one. It's definitely a great way to talk about the way that some rural small business paradigms differ. And I think in ways, many of the things we'll talk about are sort of baked into the DNA of what happens when we live in smaller groups of people. So juxtaposed to Janessa's incredible talk, and looking at the global implications of connectivity, we'll zoom in a little bit to look at how that works local, but also in smaller groups, in really intentional community. So we're going to zoom in. One fun thing I wanted to add, Janessa had said, you know, if we look at paradigms, and the positioning of an individual or a group inside of a paradigm, and sometimes how we might look at, say, something like, you know, a branch of government or such, and say, well, they're stuck in the paradigms of 20 years ago. Through my work, I actually learned, through working with Joel Barker, I had the pleasure and opportunity to work with Joe Barker extensively for a couple of years around work he was doing with implications and strategic planning in a way that really baked in physics. And what I learned from that incredible experience was that when we solve for things that may be a paradigm shift or resistance to a paradigm shift, when we solve for them, we can actually travel time. And so where you may have been 20 years behind with a paradigm, once you solve for that in yourself, which can happen in an instant or in a group, you basically travel time and catch up. So that's very fun to think about, and a lot of what we'll look at today as I do my best to give visual constructs for some of these things, in part because I'm a very visual thinker, but my constructs are also, I often look for things that are built on basic principles of physics that allow for movement or kinesthetics, because we're all traveling the wave of time all the time. It's an inescapable part of living. And inside of things like paradigms or opposites or paradoxes, all of these things that we sort of dance with as we live and evolve, nothing's ever definitively black and white. And so I do think there's a lot of movement there in the way that we navigate our place and acceptance of the things that we're sort of playing with, whether personally or in business. So today we'll focus more on rural small business paradigms. And to Jamie's last polling question, one of the first times I really took note of this was about 5 or 6 years ago in my community in Gunnison. And I was building the Innovation Center here at Western Colorado University. And I was contacted by somebody out of Denver running the Conscious Capitalist Group, working on those triple bottom line principles. And they were interested in doing a bit of a roadshow to rural communities. And I said, sure, I'm happy to host you, of course. And so I hosted them. We had a room full at lunch of about 50 business owners who came to listen to this. And it was a funny thing to watch my community react to that at that time, and how many people leaned in and were just kind of like shrugging their shoulders like, this is how we've always done business. And so something that emerged as a need or a paradigm shift in more of a corporate dynamic or potentially an urban dynamic was quite different in terms of how rural was operating. And I've had time to study this, not just over the last 5 or 6 years in my work to support startups, but as a business owner and also a 25-year rural resident here in Gunnison, Colorado. For those of you that don't know, it's population about 6,000 in a landmass twice the size of Rhode Island. So we are fringe people And I have a deep passion for rural. As director of Startup Colorado, our mission is to support rural entrepreneurs across the state. So when I started looking at key paradigms, as Jamie asked me to come today and speak to you all, I thought, let's just look at the three key ones, of which there are many different types of behaviors and paradigms that ripple from them, but they are core aspects. And certainly Janessa pointed a lot to community, but we'll also talk about trust and how there's maybe a slight variation to how rural small business owners and entrepreneurs think about economy. When I look at these things, for me, I often, I've really come to, at least for right now, and all these constructs can always change. But right now I'm thinking about paradigms in terms of being on a teeter-totter, right? So if we looked at the paradigm of community and we looked at what that was shifting potentially away from, maybe it was something overly independent or individual, and that something grows. And what's nice about this is that we can look at paradigms and see that we want to keep them both in motion, because it's maybe not as black and white as one reigning superior enough to completely wipe out or amass the other. Because if community grew too heavy, maybe this teeter-totter would fall. And so how does an individual foster the individual and participate in community? And how do we keep those two things? And as we look at this today, the balance point of the teeter-totter are things that are really central to ourselves personally and professionally, and inside organizations, inside governments and countries and communities. And that's our convictions or our mission, our outcomes or our goals. And there's, of course, lots of ways that we define community. And so what we'll look at today is, if we look at how rural business owners operate around community, one thing I've become incredibly impressed with always was that, there's a real sense in a different way of dependency and sense of place. We actually think of a lot of our rural entrepreneurs as place-based entrepreneurs, because they have a real dedication to place. And if they're building a company, often in a rural place, there's a different set of challenges, sometimes a very different set of opportunities. And there's just this greater sense of dependency in how all the aspects work together. So things we really see in our rural entrepreneurs is a stronger sense of collaboration, or what we would call healthy co-opetition, in ways that they work together. We've seen this continue to grow and increase in our work as we build a stronger network with incredible partners like Jamie across the state, who are dedicated to this newer paradigm around community because of our convictions of the benefits of it, right? And inside of this sense of community that our rural entrepreneurs have, there's a lot of what we see sort of agreed social contracts and support networks, that it's just easier when you have that real sense of community to develop those and to rely on those. Something else really important with rural entrepreneurs is resiliency, and in small business. It allows for a lot of resiliency, and that's something I think is really telling at this moment during the pandemic, where certainly there is sufficient fear and loss of business and small business happening. There's a lot of resiliency that we're seeing in the support that entrepreneurs are getting from each other and their communities. But also resiliency that was baked in. Many of our communities in a rural sense, if we look at part of why this paradigm exists for them, is if we took an example like agricultural communities on the eastern plains of Colorado, many of those communities are weathering economically just fine. But they have been riding an uncertain wave of agriculture for many decades. And a lot of those communities, when you work with them, you see that they're really built in a way where you get this sense that no matter what happens in the world, that community will take care of itself. And they have a real different way that they navigate with that sense. And this is not to say these things don't happen in urban environments. They're just more baked in and quite obvious. And a lot of it has to do with living in a smaller population. And we'll explore some of this more, especially as we navigate into trust. And as we look at community in our world, we generally look at, facets of community. There's lots of ways to break that down. Everybody identifies differently with community. And a community is a company, the culture inside that company. A community is the physical community where that exists, or a region, and then also the community of industry in which somebody's operating. All those things can facet around whether an individual or a community comes together, right? So if we looked at this with industry, how does an industry support itself? It operates as a community versus singular nodes of an industry. Communities come together and companies come together in the way that we teeter here. But one of my favorites, and something I actually really picked up from Joel Barker, there's a book called Trust by Francis Fukuyama, which remains one of the best books I've read on economy to date. I highly recommend it. It's a weighty tome, but we've got an interesting January and February ahead of us, so maybe we're all looking for more pages to turn. But it really looks at the sole component of trust as a critical factor of economy. And it's something I think we're hearing talked about more and more, and it's showing up. But if we look at the history of rural places and the way that they also dance together, trust becomes a core component. And we see that inside, right? If we look at those layers of community, we see it inside of a company culture and the way that a staff and or its consumers resonate with that company. Great companies that operate with trust, an easy example for most people to really wrap their minds and hearts around is a company like Patagonia, right? So very built in, supportive of their staff. We know there's a lot of trust there, and consumers generally trust it. They don't hesitate to spend a premium because they trust the decisions that company is making. So trust becomes a really critical component and something really baked in rural. What's interesting about this in rural, and this is the way that paradigms get more complex, is rural places and communities tend to have more baked in trust internally. And what will happen is sometimes when somebody new comes to town, you have to kind of earn your stripes or your trust coming in. So there's a bit of a distrust of the external versus trust internally. And this aspect of trust can allow, and we see this variable in communities and in companies, but can allow for better communication inside of a company. It can allow us to have shared values and accepted differences. And something we hear about more and more is it's really based on transparency and vulnerability. And once that trust is in place, it can be put into play more and more. If I thought about what the balance point or the opposite of trust looks like, it gets a little bit more complex when we look at trust. And we can look at, you could look at all the nodes of behaviors that come off of a core behavior like trust. But trust versus lack of trust is the easy one. But if we think of a company in a place of trust, do the staff have built-in trust inside of a company? And if they do, they're likely to stay with that company for a long time, versus if you had lack of trust that was a safe environment, you're probably shopping for another job. Additionally, when we look at this idea of collaborative support networks and what we see in the rise of community behaviors in business, is that increasing trust breaks down competitive barriers. And so people are more transparent with their goals and their challenges as business owners. And also, if we look at, it's like talking about somebody with politics, right? They would say like, oh, they keep their politics really, really close to the chest, and it's kind of laying down that veil. But we know that trust and lack of trust, we have to have real shifts around too. Just like if we looked at two components on this teeter around being judgment versus discernment and the differences in those two things. So trust gets very complex, but if we look at these things inside of a company, it would be looking at how are you making moves strategically towards the paradigm that you want to be shifting toward, how are you and your staff and your teams and your consumers, how would they position you towards this paradigm of trust versus lack of trust? And this is a big one for institutions these days, right? I think we have more trust inside of our small businesses in the private sector. And there is a moment of reestablishing sort of where we sit with this politically and with government for many people, as we saw in the poll at the start. But I see entrepreneurs in rural places really building companies with a lot of transparency and vulnerability and a lot of trust baked into their teams. I've seen it for several decades. And they trust their community as well to have their back, or their community trusts that they're bringing good jobs to the table. All of these things really point to the way these things dance together within an economy. And one of the most telling things about how community and trust function differently in rural places is rural entrepreneurs. I've yet to meet one who doesn't really understand the impact they make on their local economy. And that's by nature, I believe, of living in a smaller group of people. You just see your impacts. A singular impact of one person ripples out farther and wider and deeper generally than in an urban environment. And that has a lot to do with people wearing multiple hats, but also just that you're making a bigger impact by nature of being inside of a smaller base of people. So you have a deeper understanding of those impacts. When you talk to rural entrepreneurs about their goals are to create meaningful, well-paying jobs for their communities. And that's not something you hear in everybody's initial, business, vision and mission. They have a real commitment to company culture and community success. They're generally wearing multiple hats. They're on different boards. Sometimes they're mayors and sit on city council. They're volunteer firefighters, and they have real human-centered leadership. So again, on that spectrum of, where does this teeter? If we look back to something like conscious capitalism, it's economy versus sort of profit for profit's sake, right? And a commitment to the full spectrum of economy. So that's the short and sweet of what I have today. There's a lot inside of this. I think largely in navigating paradigms, it's looking at your position in that teeter-totter as an individual or as a group, and it's looking at, does X decision align with our desired convictions? To explore the placement of our group convictions, mission, outcomes, or goals on that paradigm spectrum, and to track our progress towards a tipping point of desired changes within a paradigm shift. And I will pass it back to you, Jamie.
I've lost my internet 4 times since you've been speaking.
Oh.
So I'm back.
And sidebar, Jamie had to rescue me last week when I lost all internet and cell phone while kicking off a major academy. And I drove from Gunnison to Salida and got to hole up in her office. So
yeah, and my desk was very dirty. I'm not sure that Leanne, I think she can share screen. Oh, perfect. So here's Delaney's contact information, and also another great quote from Delaney. And Delaney, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and I look forward to our Q&A time. Next slide. Our last poll is more to do with self. In 2020, have you found yourself tuning out, numbing out, or feeling that you shouldn't feel a certain way? And the question is yes, or the answer is yes, no, or much more than I ever thought possible. So we'll give it a few more minutes. And actually, the answer is 80% yes and 20% no. So now we'll end that poll. And next slide, please, Leanne. I have a wonderful dear soul and friend, Jenna Pfingston, who is the owner of JalaBlu Yoga. And she's an Embodied Portal teacher and practitioner. Jenna has expanded her profound offerings and now is offering She's an Embodied Wisdom Facilitator. If that doesn't sound cool, what? She navigates clients into the feeling body so that frozen energy can move into a state of flow. And she has incredible sessions on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Insight Timer. And I actually, I think it's next week on a Saturday maybe, I'm going to have my first session with Jenna to see what the embodied wisdom can do for me. So please help me welcome Jenna Pfingston.
Thanks, Jamie. And thank you, beautiful goddesses, Leanne and Delaney. Very inspirational invitations from you both, and so connected to what I would love to invite us all into within these next 20 minutes. So it looks like most of you, it said, I believe Jamie said 80% decided to turn on the numb out button, which is perfectly understanding within this world at this time. And I'm here to connect more into the paradigm of the self. And just like Jamie stated in the beginning, she went through a big paradigm shift within herself when her beloved passed, left his physical body. And for 2 years, it brought her to her knees and sent her within a transformational time within her life. And yet, after it had moved, the process had moved, and she awakened to look at it as a gift and as a blessing. So I have JalaBlu Yoga in Buena Vista, Colorado, and it's now called JalaBlu Collective Healing. And so even though I'm talking about the self, the invitation to be more embodied within the self rather than disembodied, and how do we get there, it also merges into that invitation of being collective. So whether we live in a city or we live in a small town, and I really loved where Delaney went within the invitation of small businesses and how they have a really big impact, sometimes even more so than living in a big city, because the vibration of what we're offering is to a smaller population. And then there's that invitation of community. And I just have to say, I hold so much gratitude for the community that I live in, because Buena Vista really supported JalaBlu Collective Healing during these challenging times during COVID, and we're still experiencing those in a huge way. And I have a feeling we're going to go through another big wave, as we all know. But today I want to talk to you about the power and wisdom of sensuality. And some of you are probably wondering, well, how does that even relate to the paradigm shift within the world, within the self, within businesses, within a city, or within smaller communities? So in 2017, and I had been, well, I've taught yoga for basically 13 years, and I've owned JalaBlu for 10 years. I'm constantly diving into the self, and I'm constantly inviting my students to dive into the self. And yet in 2017, I knew that there was something within me that seemed, well, I was so numbed out. I was basically swimming within my own suffering, and I'm not going to go into that story, but my own pain. And so while I was in the pain and while I was in the suffering, and that doesn't mean that you can't be embodied or even experience pleasure within the pain, because pain and pleasure are within our fingertips. They're at our fingertips at all moments. Even when Janessa was bringing us into her beautiful story of how she went on the run, and she felt that energy and she of war all around her, and she had to make that choice of, does she choose the river, or does she choose the war? And she chose the river, even though she didn't know quite what that meant. And so even that is bringing us into the invitation of sensuality, that invitation of the state of flow within our lives, rather than being stuck or frozen or always numbing out. And so the invitation is that the more we can connect with the intimacy of ourselves, and that's moving us into sensuality, the more we can connect or even embrace ourselves as a lover, leaning into ourselves as a lover, and connecting back into sensation and sensitivity, connecting into our senses again. We wake up every day and we can get so caught up in the busyness of life, especially speaking to women. Many of us are putting on a lot of different hats. We're mothers, we're grandmothers, we're career oriented, we're career driven, we're wives, we're single mothers. The list goes on and on and on. And so we can get really caught up in the to-do list, to do, what's next, searching for the answers, wanting to be successful at times with the expectations of society, the expectations of our lineage, of our family. And so then we lose that connection to what is within, what's the wisdom within, to trust within. And we start to connect more into the feeling body. I'm going to slow down because I feel like I have so much to say, but I'll say what needs to be said within these 20 minutes. We have lost that connection into the feeling body. And it's as simple as this. Our feelings are meant to be felt. And so even now, as I speak to you, my heart is racing a little bit. I'm nervous. And at the same time, that's a pocket of aliveness that I'm embodying that feeling within. But what happens is we lose that connection because we feel like we should be this, or we should be that, or we shouldn't say this, or we shouldn't say that. Or even if we're working with a team, that perhaps we don't always speak our truth. And yet our truth is energy within our belly and within our heart. It's the way that we feel. And so we don't say what we really want to say. Even in the inspiration and creativity of a new project or an idea or a brainstorm session, whatever it is. So the work that I move into with a lot of clients beyond yoga is defined as primal embodied wisdom. And so it's an invitation to return back into your primal body, your animal body, to trust your innate instincts, to recognize that our innate sensuality is always there. So obviously I could talk about a lot of different branches when I use the word sensuality. I could talk about sexuality or sex, but obviously I'm not going to talk about that within this portal, although I love to talk about it. So anybody who wants to get a cup of tea, I'm here, I'm there. But sensuality is even how do you look at yourself? How do you see yourself? How do you feel when you feel pleasure, when you're eating divine, yummy food? How do you feel when you have an aha moment, an awakening? How do you feel when you have clarity? Like it just feels good to know that this is your next step and that you've trusted the unfolding of it. So in 2017, like I said, I had pretty much numbed out because I was swimming within my own pain and suffering of a story within my life. And I realized I was so disembodied. And I found one of my teachers on the path, and her name happens to be Jenna too. Her name is Jenna Ward, and she is the owner of the Embodied Art School out of Australia. So I've been studying with her since 2017, and I'm still studying with her. And she started to open up something inside of me that I had never felt before. And I couldn't believe it because I had practiced yoga for 20 years. And I was a steady practitioner. I studied the spiritual roots of yoga, the physical aspects of yoga. I had taught and have taught a million classes. I've done tons of studies, and it has been a huge pillar within my life. But the invitation of primal embodied wisdom has taken it to a whole nother level. So within the paradigm shift, the invitation of dropping more into the self is creating a stronger foundation, whether you're an entrepreneur or you work with a team of people, whether it's just women or women and men. And it's also that invitation to cultivate more of an awareness, awakening within feminine energy. And we all have feminine energy and masculine energy, but most of us, men and women, need to reconnect to the intimacy of feminine energy. And this, once again, is dropping us into the felt sense, the feeling body, the invitation to go in, the invitation to go beyond the labels. So for example, even numbing out is a sensation. So what does it feel like when you numb out within the body? And so you go beyond that label. When you're feeling anger and frustration within the world, an opportunity to close your eyes, to connect to your beloved, to your breathing body, and to really feel, what does anger feel like within your body? Most of the time it doesn't feel very good. And so we breathe into that anger and we start to infuse more compassion and gentleness and love. And just like Janessa said so beautifully at the end of her conversation, was that invitation that love is stronger. I don't think those were her exact words, but I think it was somewhere along that line. So when we can start to connect into sensuality, and we can do this in several different ways. I'll give you examples of how I'm doing this within my own life. This doesn't mean that it resonates with you. You may have different ways, but I have little rituals throughout my day. In the morning, I have little shrines and pujas, which could be anything. But for me, it's incense and candles and the invitation of the gods and goddesses in Hinduism. For you, it may be something completely different. I have flowers and I sit, and maybe it's only for a minute. Sometimes if I'm lucky, it's for 20 minutes. And it's an invitation to drop in and just notice where I'm at right in the beginning, in the morning as the sun is rising. And I simply ask myself the question, how do you want to move into this day? Like, what energy do you want to bring into this day? And then I feel that energy within me in order to cultivate it within the day. Now, that doesn't always mean that everything goes as planned, but it's a way to connect to my own sensuality. Right now, I have a candle lit, with a Kleenex, a candle lit, speaking to all of you. I have a crystal next to me, and I have essential oil. And for me, that brings me more back into my sensuality. As a woman, I love to still wear makeup and dress in lovely scarves, and this brings me more into my feminine energy. It could be the way that I look at a leaf outside, or the mountains, or the river, or how the snow falls in the sky. It's the way that I see you. It's the way that I listen to you. It's the conversations that I have, and really even feeling the essence behind my words and how I speak. When I have inspiration within my business, or I'm listening to my teachers, that's an opportunity to connect to myself and to also connect to them, which is community. I'm not quite sure how long I've gone, Jamie, but I wanted to drop everybody in a little bit into just one of my favorite practices, and it won't be for very long, but just an opportunity for you all to taste a little bit of dropping into the sensual body, that innate sensuality that we all have within us at all times. It's just that we become disembodied. We tend to numb out, or we put on our armor, and none of that is bad, by the way, because it's also an opportunity to feel. So I want to ask everybody to just come into, you're already in a seat, I assume, or maybe some of you are laying down, but really make yourself comfortable, whatever that means for you. And invite your eyes just to slowly shut down, your eyelids. And just for a moment, take in a deep inhalation and a deep exhalation. And don't be shy if you want to make a sigh, a sound, a noise, a deep exhalation. And just start to notice the breathing body. It doesn't need to be in any way. Start to lean into where does it go? Where does the breath go? Where does it not go? Where does it expand? Where does it contract? And even with your eyes gently drawn closed, start to notice the shadows and the light within your sacred space, wherever you're at. And even simply notice where you feel any contraction, rigidness, or holding on within the body. Notice any pockets of flow, so any expansion, openness, feeling of joy or bliss. And simply just noticing any energy at all, heat, perhaps a chill, texture. Noticing the air against your skin, the clothing against your skin. Are there any sounds within your space? The heat, perhaps animals, your heartbeat, your breath. Noticing smells, any scents that are around you. And then again, just returning to the breath, breathing in and breathing out. This invitation just to drop into the body. This invitation to connect with the body and the wisdom that it holds. The intuition that it holds. The feelings of pleasure, the feelings of pain, and all of the in-between. And that everything is welcomed. We're going to do one more little thing together within this short little drop-in. I want to invite you to make a sound or a sigh. So first, let's just take in a deep inhalation and exhale. Next round, let's enjoy the movement of sound. So here we go, deep inhalation. And just allow that sound to be felt, the energy, the movement, the uncomfortableness, the awkwardness, the feeling of release whatever it may be. And then slowly, when you're ready, you can start to open your eyes. Maybe your eyes are already open. So the invitation from me is that the connection to sensuality, in my opinion, can give us an opportunity of wisdom and of intuition, creativity, and just to be more awake within our lives, which moves us into collective energy, which moves us into compassion, which moves us into peace, and which moves us back into love. Thanks, everybody. That's it, Jamie.
Thank you, Jenna. And Janessa and Delaney, I invite you to turn on your cameras as well. And while we're going through that, this is Jenna's information and a beautiful quote that she has shared. And now we're going to open up to Q&A. And I think, Leanne, for this part, we could probably not screen share so that the three of us can be seen a little bit better. Hi, everybody. And I've been reflecting on the three of you because Janessa, with the Euphorities Institute, you're really working on community in a global level. And Delaney, I know a lot of your work as community builders and entrepreneur ecosystems is community. And Jen, I think of the JalaBlu world that you created in Chaffee County with the sense of community. What are some of the practices that you do to build trust and compassion? And I think I'll start with Janessa, then Delaney, and then Jenna.
Thanks, Jamie. What are the practices to build trust and compassion? Well, gosh, it's so simple. For us, it's just, so we're all on Zoom, being in the same place, and then it's hearing each other's stories. So you'll have there's an amazing young man from Afghanistan and peace builder from Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon, and I mean, just truly from all over. And so when you sink in and hear someone's story, and gosh, in a person's story, there's just like, how can it be that someone from across the world, and you're like, yes, I felt that too. And yeah, like it really, just when we hear someone's story, no matter how different they may be, there's a connection that happens. Something about story sharing deeply connects us because they resonate. It's like they're all somehow universal, even though they're individual. And so that's really what we do. Once you've heard someone's story, you just feel like you feel them, you know their struggle and their heart's desire and their goals. You just connect on that deeper level, and then that's it. Like, that's the magic sauce. You just listen to each other's story and pulling in beside and listening, and that's it.
Yeah, I would reiterate for sure. It's, listening. When we talk about community work, in a fun way, especially with rural communities, and that agent of, knowing that sometimes they won't trust something coming from the outside in. It's not pretending that we're not from the outside, but I say we don't come at it head in. We come at it head on. We come in sideways. It's just like if you're at a conference with somebody and you're standing next to somebody in the back of the room, you're more likely, while not seeing each other, to kind of make a comment, start to have conversation, and then you've said something that caught each other's attention or made each other laugh, and then you can look at each other head on, right? Or, just sometimes when we come head on, the walls go up And so we come at it sideways, or we really work to find, and I'm hearing similar in Janessa's work, it's the agent that you can find in the place to get behind and to support them. And then you can bridge in to a community that way. So there's so many angles, but once you're sharing the stories and finding that human connection and that similar thread, you know, then the barriers continue to just fall away and come down. So it's pretty incredible. And for us a lot too, we've really learned it's valuable for rural places to hear that things are being built by them and for them. And that some of building and breaking down what's perceived as this rural-urban divide, which is both false and real all at the same time, and part of that is really giving rural more focus first before that can really begin to disseminate.
With you, but how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, JalaBlu Collective Healing is very community-based and is a huge sacred space for Buena Vista. And it's really where I will never forget my first mantra for JalaBlu when I first opened in 2010 was, "Come as you are." And that still holds very true. And right now the mantra is discover the power of you. And that invitation of people coming into the space, whether they're studying yoga or they're coming to study some of my new offerings within the Primal Embodied Wisdom, is an opportunity to really dive into the self. And all these people are around you that are really seeing you and listening to you and holding space. And it's that same invitation that Janessa referred to, which is sharing our stories, sharing our tears and our joys and our fear and our pain and all of it. Just even this past winter, and actually Jamie was a part of it, was the first time I really offered a big series within the Primal Embodied Wisdom. And I couldn't believe it. We had 20 people sign up for that in this little town. And they somehow trusted me. They had no idea what it was all about. I mean, at all. And it was so beautiful to witness everybody, and so much was moved within that series, and yet everybody held everybody else.
Thank you. And I guess the next question I have, and I welcome, please put your questions in the chat so we can answer some of the attendees' questions too. But I've been thinking a lot about resiliency, particularly with my own life, you know, not being able to see my grandchildren as much, or my 90-year-old mother, but also with the small businesses that I work with. With some, we can help with grants and loans, but some there's not a solution. And with 25% capacity or 50%, it's very difficult to make it. And Janessa, I think from a worldview with hunger and, you know, all of those issues, environmental concerns, social concerns, how do you cultivate resiliency and inspire others to join in on those efforts?
Oh, Jamie, that is the biggest thing. And I don't know. I see what the folks in our community are going through. I mean, there's a man who, it's just unspeakable things, truly. And then, you know, in terms of war and conflict and losing family members and risking your life every day. And when you could, like one man in Cameroon, he sent his family away because he's right in the middle of the Civil War. And I'm like, why do you stay? And he says, I have to be here for my people, for my, you know, they're relying on me, they need me. And here's a man who has a choice to go with his little 5-year-old daughter, his wife, but he is staying behind out of a greater sense of commitment and love for a bigger cause, a bigger purpose. And then the pandemic hit, and there are people in our peace building communities who have, their communities are starving. And so they're giving what little they have. I mean, and yet, how do they greet you on the call? The biggest, most genuine smiles and just true warmth and just love and generosity pouring out of them. And I ask them, because I don't get it all the time, where does this come from? How do you do this? And they're so humble, but they, the things they answer is, you can't not. Like, it's like not even a choice in their mind. What do you, this is what you do. This is who we are. We're human beings. We care. You do everything you can. You would do what the man in Cameron said. If you were in my position, you would be doing exactly the same thing. And I'm thinking in my head, there's no way I would, but like just that deep faith in humanity and the deep love, which love does bring that courage to do unbelievable things, incredible. And so how I cultivate my little tiny resilience compared to theirs is that I see their example and I'm like, okay, if they can do this, I can do this little thing. Like, okay, maybe I, but look at theirs. And so when we have the inspiring examples of others showing amazing courage and resilience, that inspires each of us to do more in our own little way. And it's true. I can't go over, we have a group in Sudan. I'm not going to go fight ISIS in Sudan. That is their work to do. But what is my work to do? What is mine to do in my family, in my community, in my and they can't come do my thing. So I just love how we inspire each other with those examples. And the more that we see the incredible amount of resilience that the human spirit has, then that helps me cultivate more within myself.
Wow. Delaney.
I think we have a great case study for this, Jamie, in our work this last year, and how we saw organizations come together to rise in support of the rural network with the onset of the pandemic. And different, juxtaposed to what I totally just said about coming at things sideways to build trust. Sometimes that there isn't trust within a group. And even though we essentially did still kind of come at it sideways, we also came at it head on. And when I took this role in leadership at Startup Colorado, I knew there was tensions with the greater sort of small business network of business support orgs across the state. And if our conviction, and I think that's a lot of what I heard sort of in between the words of what Janessa was saying, is like there's a different sense and a depth of conviction and different things and value points and different cultures. And our conviction as an organization on a paradigm was that we were all better together, and that we weren't here to be competitive. We didn't even want to be an organization. We wanted to be a movement that could belong to everybody. And that how could we dismantle these tensions? So, and you may not know the full extent of this, Jamie, but I went to the head of the Colorado Small Business Network and said, we've got this issue. If you can create a basic sort of mandate to put all your people in a room, and I'll create a mandate to put all my people in a room for 2 days, and we'll facilitate and recognize our similarities and share stories and define a joint mission. And we did all of that. And because of that, we've seen lots of wins this last year, separately for each team. But really, because of that, we quickly were able to mount a set of crisis calls as a large group of 12 agents across the state in service to the crisis, as we watched as sort of what I thought was a bit of a communications disaster inside of the crisis, right, as we all adjusted to a life in Zoom. So this was a really cool moment to watch that win, 6 months. And it was a year ago this week that we all would have gotten together, actually. And a year ago this week, we did that work over 2 days. Within 6 months, we would have been able to come together as a team to really deliver some support during a crisis moment that made big waves in the state. We're really lauded for it because we were serving about 500 entrepreneurs a week. And when you're, per capita, that doesn't juxtapose to urban numbers. Again, these are rural numbers, but these are people spread across a lot of distance. And then also, because of that work and ongoing resiliency, now this week we officially launch a new network tool that we all decided was one of our 2 key goals as a group last year, this week. And we're exactly 1 week to the year and actually launching a big group project. So it's just this facet of like being willing to kind of take it head on and say, we don't trust each other. So let's get past that, and being willing to be honest about that.
Wow, I have to say, I was a new director. Last November, I started in August, and we were a new center, so there was no manual on how you do a center. And so I was amazed at the insecurities that I had. And here we went to this 2-day grouping, which Delaney is talking about. It was the Small Business Development Center. It was the rural reps for the Office of Economic Development and International Trade, and the rural group and team that goes under Delaney with Startup Colorado. And it was the best 2 days that I had. And I really did leave knowing people and liking them and trusting them. So when COVID hit, all of us with no manual and a lot of mixed messages federally coming at us, but they were the only tools that we could get to support our small businesses. Calling Delaney and calling Tom with OEdit and knowing them and being able to get over my insecurities and say, I don't understand this, but I need to understand it so I can help our small businesses help me. And we just collectively, it was beautiful. So sorry, I kind of interrupted Jenna, but Jenna?
No, I love listening to all of this. Yeah, I think for me, on an individual invitation of the self, paradigm of the self, is that, JalaBlu Collective Healing, like I stated before, got hit huge, and we still are getting slammed. I don't know what other word to use, but my resilience really has come from the support of community and of friends and students. I mean, I have people sending me those little cards, gift certificates to the grocery store to buy my groceries. I have beautiful clients that are supportive with donations and grants, and the community here. My teachers who did not give up. I had a friend in the very beginning of COVID, when we had to shut down, literally flipped JalaBlu Collective Healing into an online yoga studio. And I definitely hit rock bottom. This summer I went into a really good depression, whatever you want to call it, that's a label. And I shut the studio again because I needed to feel what I needed to feel. And, but at the same time, that was part of my resilience. It was part of my resilience and feeling what I needed to feel. And then, okay, it's time to step forward. It's, because we can do so much within these human bodies. What is it that Glennon Doyle says? We can do hard things.
Yes. Yes.
I love that woman. Yeah.
And yeah, I just saw in the chat, Sydney brought up that we've saw the community development and building within the nonprofit industry too. She's a board of director for the Chaffee County Community Foundation, and their grants and support to our community was an amazing nonprofit outreach and support to other nonprofits too.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to keep talking because I have more questions, but it is already 1:33. I don't even know how that's possible. I really wanted to leave with what gives us hope, but I think we need to conclude. I would love for the participants to share questions that I can email to Janessa and Delaney and Jenna after the fact, or we can even get together on a Zoom call perhaps. So I so enjoyed this session, even though I was quite nervous when I started and I couldn't even properly introduce Janessa. I would like to close it out and share that we do have these amazing, in my day job, on-demand training events. And so we have financial health, cash flow, and a brilliant storytelling series. We talked about storytelling, and we have pivot panels of storytelling during COVID, as well as startup storytelling projects. So please go to our website or our YouTube channel. Next slide. And then we have the art of storytelling. The last three Power of We, which is women entrepreneurs, have been recorded and are available on demand. And the storytelling one with Catherine Usari was incredible. Then Adrienne Reef, who works with Delaney, she's also on their board of Startup Colorado, did some sessions for us, how to pivot for greater success using Eric Rye's work, and then unlocking opportunities for your business with future mapping and creative canvases. That's another brilliant session. Next slide. And then Leanne, who's doing the tech in the background, thank goodness, since I lost my internet through this, has done incredible marketing support for our Main Street and small businesses and rural communities with how to do Shopify for beginners, Etsy, and then how to market for socially distanced shopping, which we'll all experience this winter. And she also is a SBDC counselor, so can help in all these areas. Last slide. I said last, but I was kidding. We have, from the We Forum series, each panelist always writes a blog. And so we have this 7 sessions, so 7 times 3, somebody else can do the math on that one, blogs available on our website. And they're just very inspiring. So I'd love for you to share those and read those. And now, last slide. I just want to thank you. Thank Janessa. Thank you, Delaney. Thank you, Jenna, for this session. Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And those who watch this later after it's recorded, please do reach out to us at info@centralmountainSBDC.org. Thank you.